Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll get started with the first main presentation for today, where we're going to be taking a look at how to mainstream climate change into national development priorities such that we can move on from isolated project by project basis for tackling climate change towards a more holistic, integrated approach towards achieving the commitments of climate change mitigation and adaptation, both internationally, but also to address the national implications that the impacts and the opportunities that climate change poses to Trinidad and Tobago. So for this presentation, we will start off with an introduction of the linkages between climate change and development before we can actually understand what the different approaches can then be implemented to mainstream this climate development nexus within the four different entry points of development planning, which includes institutional arrangements, policy frameworks, financial processes, and knowledge and engagement. So essentially, this presentation will be divided into 6 sections, and we'll take a quick dive into each one of these six for about the next hour that we have set aside for this presentation. Before we begin, let's start off with some key definitions and terminologies to ensure that we understand each other better and we can grasp the main points that we'll be touching upon about climate change mainstreaming. So development, of course, we refer to as the series of government programs to advance infrastructure, economy, and social well-being. What we mean by sustainable development is when all of these government programs are implemented in a way that they meet the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of the future to meet their own needs. So when we talk about climate resilient development, we talk about addressing the climate vulnerability, the risks and impacts in development processes. So climate resilient development is a way to mainstream adaptation risks, adaptation priorities, and adaptation opportunities into development planning. Whereas low emissions development means ensuring that the chosen development path minimizes the sources of greenhouse gas or GHG emissions and empowers carbon sinks. So low emission development is closely linked to mitigation planning and mitigation implementation. With this in mind, we can talk about climate change mainstreaming. Really, it entails the integration of climate change risks and commitments, as well as mitigation and adaptation solutions into ongoing decision-making, planning, and investment processes. Within this, we refer to mainstreaming adaptation as ensuring that development planning adjusts to actual or expected climate change and its effects by both reducing vulnerability to climate change, but also increasing resilience against its adverse impacts. On the other hand, mainstreaming mitigation entails ensuring that development pathways reduce GHG emissions or increase carbon sinks that halt and prevent further climate change from occurring. Now, there are several benefits to mainstreaming. First of all, it addresses the intrinsic links of climate change and development by preventing maladaptation and further GHG emissions from occurring due to rapid socioeconomic development, while at the same time tapping into expanding green markets and leveraging development efforts to improve underlying socioeconomic determinants of climate change vulnerability. In addition, climate change mainstreaming unlocks more financial support to advance socioeconomic development. In fact, it allows countries to leverage the global focus on climate finance to help support development efforts that embed mitigation and adaptation lenses. Further, it efficiently allocates the use of limited resources, Oftentimes, limited resources is one of the main barriers against development or also against adaptation and mitigation. So if we can efficiently tackle both climate and development goals simultaneously by using the same number of limited resources, we can help advance both development and climate agendas. Furthermore, climate change mainstreaming accelerates climate action implementation. This entails that sometimes, depending on national circumstances, development may have a higher priority than climate action. Of course, that depends on the national circumstances. In these contexts, by embedding climate change within development efforts, a country can actually advance climate action that might otherwise have been postponed or so. Further, we can foster political buy-in by mainstreaming climate change. This helps decision makers see the risks and opportunities that are posed by climate change into the respective development goals. So we can make more informed decisions sort of to climate-proof development planning processes, and at the same time, make most use of opportunities of emerging low carbon or low emissions markets to drive socioeconomic development. Further, another opportunity is streamlining governance and reducing redundancies within the roles and responsibilities, particularly among the entities and the individuals that are closely linked between development and climate action. Further, we can improve alignment and advance coherence in the picture of the national vision in government efforts, and also improving communication and awareness, very linked to streamlined processes. Although there are a lot of advantages and opportunities from mainstreaming, there are also several challenges. For example, increased communication and data sharing is needed to enhance the coordination between climate change and development stakeholders, such that they can integrate the priorities and the risks between these two streams into a coherent picture. Further, all types of stakeholders across all sectors and levels involved in development efforts also require some knowledge on climate change science, on climate change risks, impacts, commitments, obligation, possible mitigation and adaptation pathways in order to embed these considerations into development processes. And for this, sufficient capacity building efforts, such as those that we have been engaged in this whole week and today, are critical. On another hand, there is a need for increasing the granularity of monitoring, reporting, and verification, or what we call MRV processes, to track mitigation and adaptation progress and finance as climate change is embedded into development rather than a standalone effort. And finally, development and climate change tend to have distinct cycles for planning, for financing, for implementation, as well as monitoring, reporting, and verification. So these distinct cycles not only vary between the different levels of government, between the different sectors, but between these two development and climate change themes. So to ensure that there are coordinated efforts in place and embedding climate change into development planning processes, we need to ensure that the cycles for preparing, implementing, tracking, reporting, and also updating the different development priorities and climate change priorities are synchronized. All right, so now that we have defined mainstreaming, that is the embedment of climate change considerations into development processes, we can now discuss the importance of climate change mainstreaming. And really, it all comes down to the climate development nexus. It's fundamental to highlight that climate change and development are intrinsically linked. First of all, socioeconomic development activities are one of the key causes of climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this resulting climate change from higher emissions levels in the atmosphere subsequently affect ecosystem services and also human well-being. When these systems are affected and the resulting socioeconomic impacts start to take place, then they come back in a cycle and further damper development efforts. As such, it becomes this sort of challenging cycle that is particularly difficult to break for countries that are still under development, and even more so for small island development states, due to their intrinsic characteristics that they already face challenges for development, which are then further exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. So, to break this cycle, adaptation and mitigation efforts mainstreamed into development are critical. And these efforts not only aim to halt climate change and build resilience against its adverse effects, but they can also be an integral opportunity for driving sustainable socioeconomic growth. That is also to say that climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation also come hand in hand one with each other, as we see in this pyramid on the left of the screen. There needs to be this right balance between mitigating climate change by reducing GHG emissions, as well as adapting to climate impacts by reducing the vulnerabilities and enhancing resilience by balancing the costs of climate action and climate inaction, which comes through development planning. And this is all made possible through the mainstreaming process. Mainstreaming, therefore, relates the distinct objectives of adaptation and mitigation in the context of multiple stressors. It also facilitates the alignment of sector-specific and subnational climate action with development goals. Further, mainstreaming encourages ministries and departments responsible for the various sectors to integrate co-beneficial actions, and it empowers a central leadership or coordination platform in the role of integrating action, and also linking resource identification with its mobilization. Here on the screen, we can see the positive feedback loop that I mentioned that can be achieved when climate change is effectively mainstreamed into development processes. On one hand, here, development improves many socioeconomic factors that are at the root cause of climate vulnerability, while economic diversification and growth into low carbon sectors help reduce greenhouse gas emissions while increasing GDP. On the other hand of the cycle, climate actions contribute to green jobs and green growth pathways to development. We understand green growth as a way to pursue economic development while preventing environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable natural resource use. While green jobs, we understand as those that are associated with the deployment of clean technologies and the adoption of improved environmental practices with mitigation and adaptation, or both, embedded therein. Here's another image of how these cycles can look quite different if we have climate change mainstreaming or not. So here in red on the left, we see that our societal choices that generate fragmented climate action or isolated standalone climate projects that are unaligned with development programs, they actually sustained entrenched systems and can foster unsustainable development. But here in green on the right, we observe societal choices that support low emission and climate resilient development that evolve into transformative adaptation and mitigation pathways towards sustainable development by enhancing energy systems, by enhancing land and ecosystems, and also by enhancing urban infrastructure, industrial, and societal transformative systems. Besides these cycles, it's important to recall the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as they both allude to mainstreaming processes. So the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the ratification of the Paris Agreement back in 2015 established a strong foundation for coherent implementation of climate action and sustainable development across all levels and across all sectors. So more specifically, the Paris Agreement alludes to mainstreaming by emphasizing this intrinsic relationship that we just talked about of climate action and impacts with equitable access to sustainable development. The Paris Agreement also accounts for the imperatives of a just transition and acknowledges the right to development in this pathway to low emissions on carbon resilient development. On the other hand, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, they recognize that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health, education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve oceans and forests. So taking a closer look of how these relationships come about, this graphic illustrates the synergic approach for mainstreaming climate change. Particularly, this slide concentrates on climate change mitigation. So in essence, both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs seek to pursue sustainable low emissions development. Under the Paris Agreement, as we mentioned earlier today, the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, are the primary mechanism whereby countries set and communicate mitigation targets to reduce GHG emissions. And parties to the Paris Agreement shall then track the progress of their NDCs and subsequently update their ambition based on a 5-year cycle. NDCs, however, can also serve as a principal action planning document for mobilizing SDG 13, or climate action. And as we saw earlier, mitigation does not come isolated, and when successfully mainstreamed, it can also support other priorities, such as SDG 7 on clean energy, or SDG 8 through green jobs, just as an example. Similarly, we see now on this slide how adaptation can be mainstreamed between these two agendas, whereby both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs seek to pursue climate resilient development. And more specifically, under the Paris Agreement, parties identify climate change vulnerabilities and plan for adaptation action through their national adaptation plans, or their NAPs. And they can communicate these adaptation targets to the UNFCCC through their NDCs, or through the adaptation component of their NDCs. And NAPs, therefore, can also serve, again, to support SDG 13, but can also serve to improve underlying socioeconomic determinants, such as improving water security under SDG 6, improving health care under SDG 3, improving food security under SDG 2, and also ensuring that there are sustainable agricultural and fishing practices, for example, under SDG 14 and 15. All right, so let's move on now to discuss how mainstreaming can actually be achieved. To start off, effective mainstreaming involves undertaking an integrated transformative approach. So development planning, therefore, is no longer isolated from climate change and is no longer treating climate change as a project-by-project effort, but rather as an integral pillar that's embedded within and part of all the development priorities. Climate change mainstreaming also involves empowering synergies and co-benefits between mutually beneficial measures that contribute to both climate change and to development goals. It also involves managing and minimizing trade-offs to negotiate consensus that enables parallel efforts that to ensure that they work together rather than working against each other if there are conflicting priorities in some cases. And it also involves maximizing efficiency and effectiveness of limited resources, as I mentioned, by empowering coordination and stakeholder engagement. So just to reiterate what mainstreaming is, it involves empowering synergies That means integrating various related efforts in a coordinated manner that such that the combined effect of mitigation, of adaptation, and of development is greater than their sum of their separate or isolated effects. It also involves empowering co-benefits, which in our case, it's achieved when a measure under adaptation, for example, also contributes to meeting development goals, or development goals also contribute to meeting mitigation targets, even though their initial objective was not envisioned under both streams. And of course, it means managing trade-offs. So that means in any case where development may seek high emission sectors, we look at way to manage such that continued socioeconomic growth can still be attained while ensuring a low emissions development pathway. It's critical to ensure that mainstreaming occurs at all three levels of government. And these three levels complement each other and provide a consistent framework within which to plan and implement concrete projects, actions, and measures in response to climate change. So more specifically for mainstreaming at the national level, being able to provide an overall vision and strategic policy framework within which the lower levels or the sectors or the local entities operate. And at this national level is also the link with the UNFCCC and also coordinates international support for climate change action. At the sectoral level, we operate and implement the national vision and strategic policy framework specific to the sector, and the local levels address the imminent concerns of the climate impacts and empowers inclusive solutions down at the communities and down at each pilot project or program or initiative. So to ensure effective mainstreaming, we need to combine a top-down approach which is primarily focused on economy-wide development goals and international commitments and adopts a medium or long-term perspective. And we combine that with a bottom-up approach that is usually focused on social and economic well-being more at the local or grassroots level with shorter time horizons, and merges these two timeframes and these two perspectives, stakeholders, and priorities into effective integrated mainstreaming. So the benefits of this combined approach is ensuring a uniform vision and addressing the finances and scaling up solutions down from the local level, while facilitating the integration, effectiveness, and efficiency within these international and national level commitments. But to achieve mainstreaming through this combined approach, we need a comprehensive understanding of the linkages, the opportunities, and the risks and constraints between the different stakeholders and between the different elements. And we need a more streamlined coordination mechanism to align the different priorities between the national level, different sectors, and the different communities. Vertical integration then is critical for mainstreaming. And when we refer to vertical integration, we refer to this creation of intentional and strategic links between the different levels, so international, national, subnational, and local entities, to effectively mainstream climate change in all levels of government. So I want to highlight here that the Paris Agreement actually recognizes the key role that is played by subnational authorities and local organizations in advancing adaptation and mitigation to climate change, because they're at the front line of ecosystems and communities that are most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. And they are also spearheading local level and traditional knowledge for reducing GHG emissions. But the Paris Agreement also highlights that these subnational efforts need to be aligned with national and international dimensions of this global challenge. So vertical integration is really highlighted as a key mainstreaming effort within the Paris Agreement, and it is not a single step in the mainstreaming process, but rather it is an ongoing effort to ensure that the mainstreaming process is coherent across all different components in development planning processes. So really, there is no prescribed way for mainstreaming climate change, as the approaches really vary depending on a country's context. However, based on international best practices and lessons learned, we can extract 5 principles that support effective mainstreaming. First of all, we need to highlight the strengthening of coordination mechanisms with clear roles and responsibilities for the mainstreaming processes between development and the climate change realms. We need to build upon and reinforce pre-existing mechanisms, processes, and institutional arrangements in the country, rather than building new mechanisms for integrated climate and development action. We build upon what's already there in the country. We need to institutionalize flexibility and continuous review and update based on the results of the national transparency system and ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification results. We need to build upon foundational and technical capacities. And finally, aligning planning, budgeting, and transparency cycles. In this way, mainstreaming really requires the effective identification and mobilization of entry points. And in the context of climate change, mainstreaming entry points are these interfaces with the overarching policy framework for development planning, for which climate change mainstreaming can be embedded. And here we highlight the 4 key entry points that we'll be discussing today, which includes institutional arrangements, policy frameworks, financial processes, and knowledge and engagement. What I want to highlight as well with this slide is that climate change mainstreaming also acts as a bridge between transparency and action, by bringing forth more accurate, consistent, complete, and coherent and pertinent information to decision makers in order to effectively and efficiently act on this climate development nexus that we explored earlier in this presentation. Right, so let's kick off now with the first entry point, which is institutional arrangements. That is, this interaction among the rules, the norms, mechanisms, laws, and policies, and also governance structures that enable mainstreaming to take place. So conducive institutional arrangements are critical for mainstreaming because they depend on several enabling factors, such as a coherent set of laws, regulations, and policies and strategies that enable mainstreaming to take place. Also, effective governance requires efficient roles and responsibilities with robust mandates and authorities to ensure that climate change priorities can be embedded within development and vice versa. Moreover, effective resource allocation and distribution is critical to bridge the gap between commitments and implementation, and also ensuring robust communication channels between the climate and the development stakeholders. So once again, there is no prescribed way to mainstream climate change into development institutional arrangements because these arrangements should build upon pre-existing competencies, the roles and responsibilities, coordination platforms, and any data sharing processes that already exist in the country. But mainstreaming typically follows these 7 steps on the screen to really highlight and embed climate change within existing development frameworks in the country. So the first step would be mapping stakeholders. So identifying the key entities and individuals from both the climate change and the development realms that should be involved to integrate their planning, their financing, and their implementation and monitoring processes. The second step would be to choose a mainstreaming degree, that is, understanding to what extent and why climate change should be embedded into different components. Then the next step would be assigning roles and responsibilities to support mainstreaming. Also establishing mainstreaming procedures and timeline, then establishing multi-stakeholder cooperation and coordination mechanisms, establishing data sharing requirements and protocols, and finally, institutionalizing or formalizing all of these arrangements to ensure that mainstreaming can be sustainable over time. And of course, integrate monitoring and evaluation and improvement embedded with continuous capacity building to enhance mainstreaming over time. If we concentrate now on the second step a little bit, on choosing the degree of formalization of these procedures, arrangements, and coordination mechanisms for mainstreaming, we typically talk about 4 degrees or 4 mainstreaming degrees. The most basic level would be no mainstreaming, that is, climate change and development take place completely independently. Then we have informal mainstreaming, where the actors that are involved in both processes sort of collaborate in an ad hoc basis. Then in our strategic mainstreaming, actual synergies are identified in planning and implementation, and there's formal coordination mechanisms, and joint initiatives are also implemented. Whereas the final or highest level of mainstreaming would be systematic. And in this case, we have a shared vision for low emission and climate resilient development that is embedded throughout. Ideally, systematic mainstreaming would be the end goal across all sectors and between all levels of government. But it's important to note that mainstreaming should be a gradual effort that actually supports development priorities over time based on national circumstances. Concentrating now on the stakeholder mapping and mobilization component of institutional arrangements, as I mentioned, the mapping process should be one of the first steps. And here we see a quick example of the key stakeholders that could be engaged from both the development and climate change realms and their possible role for mainstreaming process. So, for example, the central ministries, such as those responsible for financing, for planning, or the office of the prime minister or president, really are there to lead the mainstreaming effort as they define the national level policies and they collect revenues and provide the overall guidance and support for capacity building on the national level. Then the sector ministries and agencies take on this leadership role, but on a sectoral level, and allocate the resources that have been given to them within the priority objectives for their sector. And of course, the local governments then implement these national and sectoral policies down at their community or the regional level, and they support capacity building more at the grassroots level. If we look at Parliament, for example, they can be engaged in the mainstreaming process by using their legislative and advocacy roles to promote the integration of climate and development goals. The National Statistics Office, which is very pertinent to this training program as we're talking about national transparency and monitoring, reporting, and verification, they have a clear role to develop climate-related indicators and to track these indicators and integrate them in the performance assessment frameworks of development. And they should build capacities to collect, to manage, and analyze this climate data and these indicators on the progress of implementation of mitigation and adaptation actions into their daily and their routine activities. We also see as well scientific and academic organizations in their role to investigate the climate development nexus. We see as well investment and promotion agencies and the private sector in the role to use their capital assets to support the climate proofing of economic growth. Furthermore, we can engage our development non-governmental organizations also to address climate change risks in their programs. But on the other hand, our environmental NGOs can also address development concerns within their activities. And of course, our media, international donors, and communities also have a role to play more on the advocacy and capacity building and awareness side of mainstreaming. One tool or one approach to help spearhead mainstreaming is to identify and mobilize a climate champion within this institutional arrangement. And the climate champion really would assume a leadership role in steering the climate change mainstreaming process. These climate champions can be, for example, a respected, committed, or influential individual, a practitioner who advocates the integration of climate change consideration in development planning, or a high-level decision maker, a government official, or a government entity that can serve as an ambassador for climate change mainstreaming. Furthermore, in terms of formalizing the institutional arrangements, we have different degrees of formalization. So the highest level would be formalizing by decree the climate change mainstreaming process. We can also embed climate change mainstreaming as part of an institution's mandate. We can develop guidelines and standard procedures or protocols to provide more of a flexible approach, yet a standardized approach for entities to integrate a climate lens within their development activities. And also, we can also integrate climate change information requirements as part of development disclosures or also as development indicators. Okay, so let's move on now to the second entry point, which would be policy frameworks. When we talk about mainstreaming climate change in development policy frameworks, we talked about systematically identifying the problems, setting goals, development policies, implementing plans, monitoring outcomes, and engaging stakeholders, such as we mentioned, climate change considerations are embedded within development efforts. So really, this mainstreaming of climate change into planning, regardless of the level, regardless of the sector, it involves this continuous bidirectional process, as we illustrate here on this slide, whereby on one hand, a climate lens is applied on development plans to integrate climate-specific considerations in development objectives. But on the other hand, climate change objectives should empower the synergies and the co-benefits of development efforts and also manage their trade-offs. So when we talk about a climate lens, we talk about systematically assessing the risks, the impacts, and the opportunities of climate change when we are planning or updating development efforts from GHG emissions and from a vulnerability or resilience perspective. So a climate change really examines, first of all, the possible vulnerability of this development plan or this development project on climate change risks and the extent to which these risks are being addressed through the development program, plan, project. We also examine the possibility that the plan can lead to increased vulnerability or can enhance the exposure of certain population groups or certain geographic areas to climate risks. This is what we refer to as maladaptation. We also examine the contribution that development plan or project may make to increasing GHG emissions or reductions. We also assess the need for further studies or investigations such that we can better analyze these above mentioned topics, and also any amendments that might actually be required in the draft development plan, the draft development project, to better address these climate risks that we identify and to reduce the GHG emissions that might be associated with the project or the program. So some tools that can help decision makers to apply this climate lens when developing a project or a program or even a policy. We have here sector scripts, risk screening, and risk assessments. They're quite related, but they increase in granularity or in intensity when we examine these three tools. So the most basic tool would be a sector script. These sector scripts are more of an exploratory exercise that can explore the interrelationships between climate change and development, and they can sort of help build stakeholder awareness by sector of these risks and opportunities of climate change. On the next level, we have more precise questionnaires that come about through risk screening that provide a step-by-step approach to answer all of these questions that I just mentioned and to identify if we need to investigate further before actually approving a development project or a development policy. And finally, a risk assessment would be an in-depth study of the specific vulnerabilities of the specific GHG emissions that would come about from this development initiative. So let's take a closer look at sector scripts. As I mentioned, these are overarching guidance documents to build awareness among development decision makers that include 4 key information items. First of all, how can climate change affect each sector, either positively or negatively? Second of all, what adaptation options exist in the sector? Third, what are the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions and the emission drivers of the sector? And fourth, how can the sector contribute to mitigation? So really, it's more of an awareness raising or a mapping exercise of the nexus between climate and development. The risk screening questionnaire then looks at this yes-no approach to identify if more specific action is required to alter a development program or plan, or to identify if more information is needed to understand the risks and opportunities of climate change. And we look at 4 categories of questions. The first would be the prolonged implementation. So we look at what the expected lifetime of the policy, of the plan, the project, or the program is, keeping in mind that a longer implementation period introduces more climate risks and may impede the rapid response action that's necessary to build adaptive capacities. Then on the exposure and vulnerability bucket, as we may call it, we look at questions such as, will activities be implemented in geographic areas that are particularly exposed to climate change impacts? If the initiative or the plan or program involves sectors that are particularly exposed to climate change impacts? Could climate change jeopardize the achievement of development objectives and expected development results? Do stakeholders of the development activity belong to vulnerable groups? Pardon me. And do stakeholders lack the awareness or the capacity that's required to adapt to climate change? So those are the key questions that we examined in a risk screening for exposure and vulnerability. Looking at the risk of maladaptation, we look at questions such as the lack of resources among stakeholders to adopt climate resilient or risk prevention and mitigation measures as well under these development programs. Could the initiative actually result in either directly or indirectly increased vulnerability to climate change? So that's what we look at under the risk of maladaptation. And finally, the risk of increased GHG emissions, we look at sort of in a general manner, the GHG emissions profile that can be associated with the particular development pathway that's proposed through the policy, through the plan, or through the program or project. A risk assessment then ramps up these questions that we just examined through a specific vulnerability and risk assessment, or through a specific GHG emissions inventory for or projections for the associated development plan, project, program, initiative. So I want to stop for a moment and dive into a quick case study of an example of climate change mainstreaming already observed in Trinidad and Tobago through the national tourism policy. Of course, this is just an example to illustrate how this has already started in the country. Of course, we can observe mainstreaming in other policy documents, but just as an illustration, we can take the national tourism policy as an example. So this policy in Trinidad and Tobago identifies the key challenges for the sector, identifies the vision, the guiding principles. It contains a series of policy statements for 17 different critical aspects of tourism, and it explores the alignment between the tourism development and the sustainable development goals. So here, highlighted in blue, we can recognize right away some components of mainstreaming embedded within the objective of this policy. So for example, the objectives policy recognizes the role of tourism in promoting environmental conservation and decoupling economic development from environmental degradation as well. And it seeks to adopt environmental conscious initiatives that are aligned with the green economy. Further, the policy explicitly states that it supports the elaboration and implementation of climate mitigation and adaptation strategies to provide development for a climate smart and resilient tourism destination in the country. Furthermore, among the 17 critical aspects of tourism, the aspect 14 highlights climate resilience, disaster risk management, and environmental sustainability as one of the aspects for which policy statements were developed in this document. And here, I know it's probably quite small for you, so I'm going to zoom in. It's a screenshot of the alignment that has been identified in the policy between the tourism development goals and linked mitigation and adaptation efforts. So I don't know if you're able to zoom, if you can see the zoomed in version, Leon.
We see it again, but it's a bit all over. I think it's just a connection. Can you move back a slide and then back again?
Yes, one moment. There we go. You able to see?
Yes.
And here you should see a table with the SDGs.
Not yet. Yes, now we see it.
Now you see the table?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, thank you, Leon.
No worries.
So here the text is quite small, so just an overview. The policy also highlights the alignment of the tourism development goals within the policy and how it aligns with climate change mitigation and adaptation. So for example, it highlights how the sector through renewable energy initiatives and energy efficiency can actually contribute to mitigate energy-related GHG emissions. And under SDG 13, the policy identifies how tourism can contribute to building a climate resilient pathway for the sector. Okay, so let's move on now to our third entry point, which is financial processes. I want to highlight here that the integration of climate-related measures in policies, strategies, and programs may have positive and negative implications on revenue, as well as expenditure sides of a country's fiscal strategy, its budget, and its medium-term expenditure framework. And this slide, just as an illustration, provides some examples of the implications of climate change mainstreaming on public revenues and expenditures. So if we look at the revenue side, mainstreaming can actually increase income in a public income in a country through, for example, expanding green economic activities or low emission sectors through the incorporation of a carbon tax, for example, the receipt of international grants, support or enhance trade for low carbon or climate resilient projects and sectors. Also the use of clean development mechanisms or carbon credits, for example. But mainstreaming can also decrease revenues by decreasing profits from high emitter activities. In the expenditure side, well, we can see significant increases in expenditure arising from climate change mainstreaming. For example, through climate change subsidies and incentives, through investments, heavy investments in climate change infrastructure, through the direct funding of projects, programs, or initiatives through the government budget, and also capacity building and awareness costs. But climate change mainstreaming can also decrease expenditures through reduced loss and damage costs by effectively building resilience and adaptive capacity against climate change impacts, also reducing spending into GHG intensive sectors or activities, and also cost savings from increasing efficiency, not only through energy efficiency measures, for example, but also internal efficiencies in planning processes by streamlining instead of siloed climate and development processes into aligned efforts. So, as I mentioned repeatedly in this presentation, there is no prescribed way to mainstream climate change into financial processes, but some international best practices highlight that the allocation of resources for climate change should actually be developed based on well-designed and well-costed comprehensive programs, which is better than by doing so by department or economic classification. Also, international best practice highlight that to be credible, programs need to be based on sound economic analysis. So extensive studies on the costing of climate change mitigation and adaptation actions, on how their integration can either into development programs can either increase or decrease expenditures over time. And also to foster buy-in, a good understanding by the ministries of finance on the opportunities and challenges of climate change is also critical. Other best practices include the public disclosure of the cost and expected benefits of climate action, also incorporated a medium-term expenditure framework, which is highly beneficial given that mitigation and adaptation concerns and responses usually require medium to long-term financing. So if the budgeting process in a country can be aligned with this medium or long-term vision of climate change, the mainstreaming process can be facilitated. As we saw with institutional arrangements for financing as well, we need to combine top-down and bottom-up approaches for vertical integration, and also addressing the appropriate entry points within the financial cycle. I'm referring here within the public financing cycle of climate change. So if we take a look at these entry points within this cycle, we identify here 6 main entry points for climate change mainstreaming in financing. The first one is the strategic planning entry point. In this first stage, it is crucial to estimate the costs of climate change, particularly specific climate change actions, plans, NDC costing, for example, costing of the NAP, and also estimating the costs of mainstreamed climate change components into the development plans. This stage also encompasses mapping of possible finance sources and finance instruments, both on the national level, but also looking at international support or international mechanism. Also increasing knowledge among stakeholders on how to make bankable projects, and raising awareness and buy-in on how climate change opportunities can actually contribute to economic growth. and aligning these national budgeting processes with finance strategies that are often crafted for NDCs, that are often crafted for NAPs. In our second entry points, we have the reallocation of funds when we're actually formulating and approving a national budget. We tend to reallocate fund to priority sectors that can contribute to climate change and development at the same time. So we can prioritize those sectors or those activities that are the highest emitters of GHG emissions, or those that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts. Also, actions that are most effective or impactful in advancing both climate and development actions, and also those that are falling behind compared to goals, so that we ramp up activities in those priorities to meet set targets or to meet the pledges that we have in the international community. Also, we can at this stage add climate change considerations in the criteria that is used for screening and for selecting projects and investments, and also looking at strategies to manage climate change financial risks or risk transfer mechanisms as well. When the planning is done for the national budget, we can actually move on to budget execution. Climate change mainstreaming here really involves using climate responsive procurement and addressing execution challenges. Accounting and monitoring, yes, really involves tracking all climate-related public expenditures, and a tool that can be used is a climate budgeting tagging mechanism. Why tagging might be important is because even if a specific climate change category or climate change category exists or line item exists within a climate change or within a national budget or a sectoral budget, there are also climate-related expenditures that are embedded into these national and sector programs that may not be easily identified. And so in most cases, the official budget classification does not have these specific categories or line items for climate change. So a climate budgeting tagging mechanism helps us facilitate or categorize those budget line items that either explicitly tackle climate change or that have embedded climate priorities within development actions. And climate budget tagging also facilitates monitoring reporting processes and facilitates reporting to the UNFCCC, because we know that starting December 2024, biennial transparency reports are starting to come in once every 2 years, yes, and developing countries should report on the support that is needed and received. So climate budget tagging can help facilitate reporting this information under the Paris Agreement. In the audit and evaluation entry points, a critical tool that might be useful would be a climate public expenditure and institutional review, or a CPEIR, which helps us analyze the allocation, management, and result of climate change-related public expenditures and whether these achievements are actually meeting planning goals. And it helps us analyze the formulation of climate change policy and its linkages to expenditure, as well as the institutional mechanisms for controlling climate change expenditure. Here we see the 3 pillars of a CPEIR. So the first pillar would be policy analysis. Again, how climate change policy is developed and linked to expenditure and linked to budgeting processes. Pillar 2 would be the institutional analysis for climate change expenditures. And pillar 3 would be the actual costing and classification of climate change investments. And finally, policy review. Here it's critical to apply a continuous improvement lens by assessing results, identifying strengths and weaknesses, and planning and prioritizing improvements. Another quick case study here, just to highlight how climate change is already being mainstreamed in Trinidad and Tobago, and possibly start already to brainstorm how mainstreaming can be improved, is the most recent 3-year public sector investment program from 2023 to 2025, which seeks to support a medium-term programming agenda in the country to facilitate the achievement of several specific SDGs. Climate change here is one of them, and also aligned with the National 2030 Vision, the National Development Strategy of Trinidad and Tobago. So for a quick illustration here, this 3-year budget is allocated on 5 thematic areas. And in the next slides, we'll quickly run through the ways that climate change has already been embedded into each one of these 5 themes. So for example, under theme 1, we have building globally competitive businesses. Climate change appears in this budgeting system through the promotion of sustainable agriculture, through the reduction of vulnerability of tourism sector, and through the provision of support for environmental protection in the non-energy manufacturing sector. Under theme 2, we have improving productivity through quality infrastructure and transportation. So climate change has been mainstreamed by, for example, investing in well-developed and climate-resistant road infrastructure, integrating flood and drainage management, stabilizing water resources, and in enhancing water security, and also through disaster preparedness for electricity infrastructure. In theme 3, which looks at putting environment at the center of socioeconomic development, we look at climate-related aspects such as coastal protection, climate-smart agriculture, integrated water resource management, afforestation, agroforestry, sustainable soil and land management, reforestation, and creating an enabling environment for the adoption of renewable energies, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles. Theme 4, we have delivering good governance and service excellence. So, for example, improving disaster risk management capacities. And under theme 5, we have putting people first. So, urban upgrading and revitalization can be one of the ways that climate change has already been mainstreamed within these 3-year PSIP. So here, well, it will be quite small for you, but it is a screenshot of one of the selected development interventions of these public sector investment program, which contains the line items for the main programs and projects under these various themes and the expected expenditure for the following 3 years. Of course, here, if we take into account the concepts that we just talked about, we can already start to brainstorm how can climate change mainstreaming be improved. For example, could a tag of which lines contain mitigation or adaptation components be helpful? What about weighing those budget line items that explicitly link to climate change or those that are embedded within development? So it's just a case study sort of to move our brain cells a little bit and start brainstorming ways of how climate change can be mainstreaming also into budgeting processes. And we're nearing the end of the presentation now, right on with the agenda, with the last entry point, which is knowledge and engagement. Here I want to highlight that a prerequisite for buying and participation is the access to and the sharing of updated climate change information. And here, the national transparency system really is key for supporting mainstreaming. This transparency system in Trinidad and Tobago collects information on the greenhouse gas inventory, the mitigation implementation and effectiveness, climate change impacts and adaptation, and their progress and effectiveness, and also support needed and received. So all of this information can be used by the different decision makers to not only comply with international reporting obligations, but to help embed climate change through an informed manner into development processes. And to do so, to really mobilize the NTS for mainstreaming, we can look at building capacities at the individual, institutional, and systems level to enhance behaviors and skills between individuals, to raise climate knowledge and awareness, and to improve their skills to participate in these decision-making processes. At the institutional level, we look at optimizing the organizational performance and looking to enhance existing institutional arrangements. And the systems level, we look at enabling conditions such as policies, economic, regulatory, and accountability frameworks to secure this political buy-in and enhanced coordination and collaboration for mainstreaming. So thank you very much. That concludes this presentation, and happy to address any questions you may have at this time. Thank you.